teachers of color, Latinos in education, and pre-service teacher education with a multicultural focus. As you came in today, you received a copy of Francisco and Longoria, who I'll introduce next, latest book that we've all been reading this year. Longoria, they then, is an assistant professor of secondary education and affiliated faculty for the education and social justice minor and family and community engaged teaching. I might need some updated information. Excellent, thank you. Their research focuses on trans and interdisciplinary scholarship, exploring broadly the concepts of identity, migrations across borders, and home. Initially, they're interested in the intersections of queer identities in K-12 schooling, teacher education, and praxis. KRISTEN B. French, Blackfeet, Gros Ventre, she, her, is a full professor in elementary education and director of the Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity at Western Washington University, who we are partners with here at Eastern Oregon University. She currently assists Woodring in professional development and planning for the new required K-12 curriculum. KRISTEN's engaged scholarship includes Indigenous education, decolonizing theory, multicultural teacher education, and critical performative pedagogy. Also with us today is Elizabeth Kelly, Program Assistant for Diversity, Recruitment, and Retention. I did some research. Are you surprised? Liz graduated from Western Washington University in 2019 with a degree in Human Services and a minor in Education and Social Justice. And after graduation, she worked at the Health Center until moving to the position of Program Assistant. Her academic interests include multicultural education, social justice issues, and K-12 and higher education. She's currently pursuing a master's in social work degree and is interning through the Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity at Western Washington University, studying such centers. So this is an excellent opportunity for her. I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to our guests and invite you all to enjoy the next hour and 15 minutes of our time together exploring identities through assets-based learning. So thank you all for being here, and I will pass the mic.
Thank you for this, that introduction. We really appreciate the partnerships that we've had with Eastern Oregon University, and specifically the Center for Culturally Responsive Practices and then the Center for Equity, Education, and Diversity at Western Washington that we've developed over the years. We want to start this. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. We really do want to take a moment to thank the organizers of the session, but especially to Tanya and KRISTEN Johnson and Rayette Newman, the new incoming dean, right on, as well as colleagues and friends, what we think about them as co-conspirators in this important work. They are inspiring us to engage in their efforts to pursue equity and justice for and through Eastern Oregon University. The goal of this session is to advance a continuing conversation we've been having over the last several years with you as friends and supporters of the Center for Culturally Responsive Practices around assuring the health and well-being of all who come to our nation, our communities, our schools, and our universities. These conversations matter because they're aimed especially, or when they're especially aimed at institutional transformation generally, and how we engage with each other in classrooms specifically. The 3 sessions that we'll be doing over the next 2 days seek to deepen understandings around asset-based, identity-sustaining teaching and learning. We recognize that we all come from a particular place, so to begin, we bring you peace from the Mount Baker and the majestic Cascade Range. And by the way, Western Washington University is up there in those brown buildings right there on the hill. With the mountains, with their rocky, jagged peaks and their incredible mountain vistas, the wildflowers bursting in spring, the renewal of life, which always remind us, if we listen, to always walk in beauty. We bring you peace from the Salish Sea, home of the Coast Salish peoples, and this renewing abundance of water, where water is life. Life-giving water that nourishes us with its rich diversity of sea life, and which reminds us, if we listen, to always walk in wonder. We've been privileged to create a partnership with the Center for Culturally Responsive Practices and our Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity over the last 5 years. And we wanted to make sure that you understood how we're thinking about this from a developmental perspective, and we're trying to build on the things that we've been doing with you together over the past 5 visits that we've had with the Eastern Oregon University community. And a lot has happened. As you can see, in 2016, we began thinking about cultivating critical practices associated with culturally responsive practices, culturally responsive pedagogy. In 2017, we focused on inclusive environments for culturally and linguistically diverse learners. In 2019, we thought about how we could reimagine culturally sustaining pedagogy, but specifically focused on equity consciousness in terms of leadership, land, and the pursuit of educational justice. Our session last year, which was, as Tanya mentioned, was remote, focused on leading, learning, and living for equity and justice with an emerging practice of thrivance. And this year, what we decided we'd focus on is creating a home in schools, partly because of the book that we published, but also because we think it serves as a really great umbrella for all the things that we've been trying to talk about over the past 5 visits that we've had with you all. And a lot has happened since May 2021. Internationally, Russia invaded the Ukraine. But think about nationally. Just this past week, the nation was memorializing the fact that over 1 million people have died from COVID. There are state efforts all around the country that, based on concerns about critical race theory, have led to decisions around banning certain books and curriculum that might cause discomfort for white students. You all probably saw that the Supreme Court has decided to repeal a woman's right over her own body, and many states have quickly jumped on that bandwagon and creating even greater restrictions. And then you can add to that the multiple efforts to limit rights of those from the LGBTQ community that you see, again, around many states around the nation. And even this past weekend, the murder of 10 people in a supermarket in Buffalo by a young white supremacist who was influenced by what was called the replacement theory. All of that is a reminder that our collective work is as important as ever. In putting together this session, we thought about what is it that we wanted to focus on and to share with you. And so this was the overview, the prospectus or the abstract that we sent to Tanya and that appeared on several of the things that were done for publicity for this event. But I just want to make sure that you understand here's where we're coming from for this session for these next 2 days. So we want to focus on both principles and precepts around creating asset-affirming classrooms that require developing the kinds of relationships and actions that are culturally affirming. It implies an active commitment to right and respectful relations. A pillar of sustaining relationships requires understanding people's identities, both your own and those of your students. And these sessions are going to focus on the conceptual relationship between these principles, precepts, and their classroom-based practices as central to creating a home and school. And that last part is really our focus for tomorrow's workshop. More specifically, we wanted to take a moment to look at what each of these 3 sessions will have a focus on. So the first focus right now is on creating affirming classrooms. We invite you, we encourage you to come this evening to the session which will focus on sustaining identities. That's from 6 to 7:30. Bring your friends, family, bring them all, come along. And then tomorrow, we will be focusing in the in the workshop on creating affirming classrooms and sustaining identities, essentially bringing those two together, but really then focusing on what does that actually look like in terms of practice. So again, we encourage you, if you have the time and energy and effort and our interest, that you make your way over to that session if at all possible. Now, even though we're talking about creating affirming classrooms and sustaining identities, we want to be sure that you understand that we see these as interconnected. These are really locked together, and they're actually mutually reinforcing. That is, that culturally affirming classrooms actually help to sustain identities, and when we help students sustain their identities, it's central to the work around culturally affirming classrooms. So even though we're talking about the culturally affirming classrooms in this session and the sustaining identities in this evening's sessions, in reality, we see them as part and parcel of a bigger picture. And we see how, again, they're both connected and mutually reinforcing. In terms of thinking about asset-based pedagogies, we tend to think about it from this graphic image of how we see these coming together. And by the way, I'll say these aren't the only four kind of academic pathways surrounding asset-based pedagogies, but four that we have been focusing on. So many of the first 3 and 4 sessions that we focused while we were here at Eastern Oregon University really focused on that top bubble around culturally responsive, culturally sustaining, and culturally revitalizing pedagogy and practices. All right, that's really has been the focus of much of our work. What we're going to be doing in the next 2 sessions, this one and then this evening, is focusing on, at the bottom, community cultural wealth. So thinking about how do we value what communities bring and the assets that students bring as a result of growing and living and being in those communities, as well as funds of identity, which is really a takeoff on the work that Luis Mola and his colleagues have done around funds of knowledge, but really begin focusing on how do we think about identity as a source of, as a positive resource for actual learning. And because there's a lot of effort in the state of Washington really following the lead of what's going on in the state of California around the development of ethnic studies, we're seeing that as now this 4th kind of aspect centering around, because all of it's focused on how do we create and sustain, or how do we create asset-based pedagogies and learning. So that's kind of where, and we're going to come back to this image here a little bit later, but just so you can see how we're thinking about what does it mean to create asset-based pedagogies. I'll turn this over now to my colleague LONGORIA to talk a little bit about the work that we did in terms of putting this book together called Creating a Home in Schools.
Hi everyone, I'm LONGORIA. Oh, sure, yes. That's for you. So Francisco and I are here to talk about our book, Creating a Home in Schools. Should I stand here or can I walk around? I can? Oh, no, okay, so I'm in a fixed position. Okay. Francisco and I, as teacher educators, had heard from our students of color for a number of years that, especially in multicultural education courses, they did not see the materials designed for them and for their needs. And I can even attest, and probably from our own experiences in teacher ed programs ourselves, that these courses and the materials were not designed for us as Black, Indigenous, or teachers of color, or BITOCs. They were largely designed for the white teaching force. And so Francisco and I really wanted to develop a text that was both love letter to BITOCs, but also to give a really clear research-based guide and foundation for work. So we used the metaphor of the house in developing this book, but also as a sort of meta message for BITOCs in actually creating a home that they could sustain for themselves in this profession. And so, we kind of want to start here in thinking about, so what does it mean to have a home for oneself. And we of course wanted to acknowledge that there are lots of different conceptions of home, but for our text, and you can read the book, and now that you have a copy, to build on what I'm saying here. But we use that metaphor of the home to really think about what are the foundations that a home should stand on. That's theory, that's context. What are the identities that we share both publicly and privately? How can we think critically about our identities? What is the kind of heart work that needs to go into that? And then how do we care for ourselves in this work? And then, of course, finally moving toward the rooftop, thinking about visioning and our futures. What does that look like? Go ahead. And so for us, we really put forward in the book a big idea that we call identity-sustaining pedagogy. And specifically, these are the ways that we theorize that BITOCs, Black, Indigenous, and teachers of color, sustain themselves, in other words, their identities, through the very act of teaching, that these are intentional acts. Another way that we've talked about identity-sustaining pedagogies is our teaching moves that help BITOCs remain who they are, to remain in their identities. So through these 4 core actions, resisting identity silence, so resisting any acts institutionally or within school systems or in classrooms where identities are not honored or where identities are being discouraged from being referenced. Francisco and I write about how teacher education especially, but schooling systems are often identity averse, that the logics of schools often say, in often implicit ways, that identities do not matter, that you can be identity neutral, if you will. We also wanted to encourage BITOCs to actively include identity in the ways and means of the classroom and in schooling. And through this process, to empower other identities, particularly those experiencing marginalization. And then what we spend the most time in the text talking about, because we believe that it's probably the hardest of these 4 core actions, is to normalize pushback, to truly confront that there will be resistance to remaining who you are, but also that that is a self-reflexive act as well, to be critical upon yourself in order to normalize that you should push back on yourself. When we remain who we are, we want to remain the best of who we are. So identity-sustaining pedagogy is not simply this kind of empty celebration of one's identity, but it is also working toward rooting out that which is oppressive or violent against other groups experiencing marginalization. Now, before we move on, I just want to pause here really briefly. What comes to mind when you all hear the term identity? And I'll go ahead, for the folks on Zoom, I'll go ahead and revoice some of the things that I hear. What is identity? What comes to mind when you hear identity? The attributes that make you, you. Okay? What else? Culture. So how we're socialized. So in like a truly Vygotskian sense, sociocultural theory, how we're socialized into identities, how others teach us about those different cultural groups. And then and religion. So all of these things helping to create the you that you are. What else for identity? Yes? Multiple identities, changing identities, that it's not a stable thing is what we heard. And indeed, identities are dynamic. They can change over time. That's one reason why being critical works, because we can reform and rethink things. But again, these are all part of a socialization. But at its core, we have identities. And then we talk a little bit about this in the text. Bev Tatum's idea of identities having dominance, or subordination. And that's something to pay attention to, that within a context like schooling, there are identities that have a hegemony, that have power and privilege, and there are those that do not. And we should also pay attention to those ideas as well. And, as some of you are suggesting here too around culture, we are socialized in very different ways. But in the schooling systems that we work in, schooling in the United States, public schooling that is compulsory. It is a place where we are all bound to be among this plurality of different cultures and identities. Isn't that enough reason for us to be paying attention to identity and culture? Oh, my time is up. Okay, yes.
Oh, I thought you were done. And we really do invite you back this evening. Really, we're going to be focusing on this question of identity way deeper and with a great extended example of what that could actually look like. So we invite you to come back for this evening's session. But as we mentioned, we're focusing right now on asset-based learning. And I want to just give a quick kind of review for, how many of you were listening on the Zoom meetings last year? How many of you? So, okay, about half of you, great. You might recall that one of the things that we were focusing on, and you might remember we had a cute little video about some ducks. Does that ring a bell if you were there? But it was really trying to understand, 4 different levels under which oppression works. And the one whole session was just focusing on what is oppression and how does it play out. And we were using John Bell's work, or what called the 4 Eyes of Oppression. And on the outer, the largest level of oppression is ideological, right? It's those ideas and concepts and values and beliefs and worldviews that really shape the way that we think about things. And as a result, if those have a form of oppression embedded in them, then that influences everything else, right? And I'll give you an extended example here in a second. That often then, if you have the thought, for example, that one group is better than another or one language is better than another, then what you do is you create institutions that then support that ideology, right? And that's the institutional level, right? So policies, practices, and procedures that then exemplify that racist ideology, right? So when we think about institutional racism, we want to get after, no question, institutional racism, but it's really embedded in the larger ideological oppression that is informing those policies, practices, and procedures. Those policies, practices, and procedures at the institutional level then embed how we interact with each other, right? So if I believe there's one language is better than another, we create English-only programs as a result. Then if you're speaking a language that's not English, then in some way, I'm going to try to oppress you either through discounting your language or tell you to speak English or whatever it is that I might feel is important, given that ideological and the fact that the institution is supporting me to hold those oppressive thoughts, right? And then all of this, according to John Bell, often leads to internalized oppression. So if you hear this over and over and over again, you actually come to believe it, even if it's negative about yourself, right? If you keep hearing over and over and over again that, speaking a language other than English is not valuable, then I'm going to feel like I speak a language that's of no value and that to some degree I have no value, right? Something that's important and precious to me, right? So I want to go back to that because this is really, first of all, it's a powerful idea. It's an important idea. But I also think it's important in the sense of helping to understand what we're pushing against when we think about asset-based teaching and learning, okay, asset-based pedagogies. So a lot of the work around asset-affirming classrooms and pedagogies really comes from work around funds of knowledge. Again, Luis Moll is the person who brought it to education, but it really is rooted in the work of Bourdieu, where basically what Bourdieu was talking about in France was that, you have these middle-class values, taste, culture, demeanor, speech, writing, et cetera, and that those middle-class values, taste, culture, et cetera, are valued in schools in comparison to other kinds of value orientations that somebody might bring in. What that does is it advantages those who come from that orientation, who come from that, in this instance, he was using socioeconomic status as the kind of the marker. It advantages people who come from that socioeconomic status via, and I love this notion of durable interpersonal networks of relationships that provide support for students' access, but especially that create within the institution support systems to support those middle-class values, all right? Now, just like many other race-based theories, groups who've been oppressed, scholars in particular who've been oppressed, have been pushing against those ideas, right? And they push against it because it says, well, first of all, what you're doing is you're centering white middle-class values, tastes, et cetera, right? So let's just acknowledge it, let's talk about it, and let's problematize that. But also, scholars of color, again, in particular from marginalized communities, have said, what would happen if we valued the cultural values, tastes, demeanor, speech, writing of those from marginalized community? What if we valued those in schools, okay? So, in a sense, the work around the conceptual understandings initially around asset affirming really come from this notion of understanding that there are other funds of knowledge out there, but that schools just do not support them. They don't value them, all right? But ask, what would happen if we were to do this? That's kind of where all of this comes from. Let me give you an example that might bring this home, close to home, and really exemplify also John Bell's 4 I's. So think about being literate. When we think about being literate, right? If you ask most people, what does it mean to be literate? Most people will say, well, you can read and write, and that you have lots of books, right? So that's an ideological orientation. That literacy means, being literate means reading books, all right? That's kind of the marker for, and that's, again, that's an ideological orientation. It assumes that because that reading and writing is valued, but it also assumes then that any other form of being literate is not valued, right? So what it does is it makes us blind to others' ways of supporting literacy besides being read to or reading yourself or providing books. As oftentimes you'll see, communities will say, we're going to have books and we're going to give them out to kids of color or in poor communities because, again, that's the notion of what it means to be literate from this orientation. Schools, then, are structured to only acknowledge one way of being literate and to acknowledge only one way of being a good parent. That is, if you don't have lots of books in your home, if you're not reading to your kids at night, then you're a bad parent. And we're going to just name it. We'll call it out, right? Groups are then compared to the degree to which there are books in their homes. And actually, there are studies where people would go in and literally count the number of books that you have in a home, and they would use that as the marker about whether you're a good parent or whether your child's going to be literate or not. So these groups are compared in important ways, and the result is that people will say things like, well, these parents just don't value education, or there aren't any books in the home, and that's a problem. And now we're moving to the interpersonal level, right? So you're starting now to critique on a one-to-one basis whether someone is a good person or a bad person, based again on the ideology and based again on what's valued in schools. Parents who don't read to their kids are told that they don't care. But in listening to counter stories, there are others who have pointed out that there are other ways parents of color do with their children that help them with education, maybe more broadly, but not necessarily with reading and writing. In other words, maybe being literate about the world, right? Maybe not literate about the word, but literate about the world. So that's an example of how all of those come together, right? Those 4 I's and this notion of kind of cultural capital. This all builds on the work of Luis Mullen and his colleagues that argue that we really need to understand the funds of knowledge that other people bring to schools to build on those funds of knowledge for academic achievement purposes and to create the social supports that Bourdieu was talking about earlier within the institution to maximize those other forms of cultural capital, those other forms of knowledge, those other forms of being literate, all right? So the focus is not on what is lacking, but rather, what are the assets? What are the funds and the capital of a particular group? What this does is it says, let's not focus on the deficiencies of those groups. That is what people can't know or can't do, but what people can know and what people can do. And there are a variety of other ways people have come into this beyond calling it funds of knowledge. You might see it as called creating third spaces or pedagogies of the home or cultural assets that we'll oftentimes see. So I want to just take a moment and just say, take a look at this picture. It was it's in the back of the photos, back of the PowerPoint slides, and it was the very first slide many of you saw when you came in. This is from Carmen Lomas Garza, and it's called Tamalada. You can probably guess what a tamalada is. It's an event where the family comes together to make tamales, right? But what I love about, and I love all of her work, and her artwork is fantastic, is that you can see lots of forms of cultural capital being exemplified here, right? You can see measuring out, you can see collaborative work, you can see conversation going on, you can see intergenerational dialogue and intergenerational learning, right? So even in this notion of like just sitting, having a family coming together and making tamales in a tamalada, you can see that lots of forms of cultural capital are being developed, valued, nurtured, built upon, etc. Right? So that's what, as one example of how we can think about, well, geez, all of those things would be fantastic for kids to bring into classrooms, right? It'd be fantastic to be able to bring those things into classrooms. So the work that has been especially important to us in this is the work about community cultural wealth and specifically with Latinx youth. And essentially what it argues is that Latinx families bring lots of forms of cultural capital that, again, could support students in schools. And Tara Yoso, your colleague there, right, wrote a book called Critical Race Stories Along the Chicana-Chicano Pipeline in 2006, where she attempted to describe a community's cultural wealth that the Latinx parents in a specific community exemplified. And all she did was she went into the community and said, how do you support your kids to be successful in schools, right? So rather than her coming in and saying, do you have books here, right? She didn't ask that. She said, what are the things you do in your community to support kids to be successful in schools? And she identified 6 forms of cultural capital: aspirational, familial, linguistic, navigational, social, and resistant capital. So real quickly, aspirational capital she defines as, and by the way, keep these in mind because we're going to do a little activity here in a second with you, the ability to maintain hopes and dreams for the future, even despite the barriers that you may be having, okay? We aspire, think about it, right? They aspire their kids to be able to be successful, even irrespective of the barriers that they're facing. Linguistic capital. They bring the intellectual and social skills learned through communication experiences in more than one language or in more than one style, okay? Again, a good form of capital to have. Navigational capital, the skills associated with maneuvering through social institutions, right? Getting your kids put in schools, being able to get your driver's license, being able to navigate, universities, being able to navigate legal systems, right? So there's this ability to navigate through kind of the systems that are important in our society. Social capital, the ability to rely on and use a network of people, not just yourself, not just assume I have to do this on my own, but I can ask my primo, I can ask my tío, I can ask my vecino, my neighbor. I can say, how does this work? And can you help me figure out how to do that? Can we work together? Familial capital, the knowledge is nurtured among familia or kin that carry a sense of community, history, memory, and cultural intuition. And finally, resistant capital, that capital associated with how to challenge inequality when you see it. Now again, Tara Yosa is going in and she's saying, what forms of capital are evident in this specific community, right? And so her book really outlines those 6 forms of cultural capital. So even illiterate parents, right, have much to offer to the quality of their children's schooling, even though much of those forms of knowledge go unnoticed in schools. All right? I'm going to just take a moment here to pause and ask if anybody has any questions or comments about this. And I'll revoice anything that anybody wants to share. All right. Terry Yosa's work was foundational, was really important. But other people have come through and asked the same question, and they've identified some other forms of cultural wealth that they would add to the original list of 6 that Tara Yoso spoke about. So political capital, that capital associated with developing a political consciousness about how oppression works in your lives and ways in which you can actively engage it politically to minimize it, or if not, to actually eliminate it. Ancestral capital, really being proud of your longer ancestral roots, the knowledge, talents, and skills and ways of being that come from our ancestors. The recognition, for example, the Latinx community, that you come from kings and queens and people who've done amazing things, all communities have done amazing things in their lives. An ecological capital, think about this in particular, thinking about farm working communities and how much ecological knowledge they have in terms of how to connect to the land, how to connect to the environment, how to see yourselves as interdependent with all living things, right? Discursive capital, the ability to use your cultural knowledge in specific ways to foster action, much in the way that LONGORIA mentioned. We can use your identities to really, if you are, you know them, you're proud of them, you feel that you use those to actually help you to be successful. And then Galvan talks about spiritual capital, a sense of hope and faith, oftentimes rooted in the belief in something larger than yourself. So here's how these all come together. And one of the books that's out there is Rethinking Ethnic Studies, right? Is Rethinking Ethnic Studies out there? And this image is from that, and there's a whole really nice description of all forms of these capital. So really encourage you to take a look at those from the book. But you can see how they all come together to form that notion of community cultural wealth. So just take a few minutes here, get you talking. As you look at those forms of cultural wealth, and I'll put it back up, just do a quick, either on your own or a turn if you want, if you'd rather turn to a neighbor, and just say, as you look at those forms of capital, are there some examples of how those worked in your life to help you to be successful? And if you're thinking about it from the perspective of coming from a dominant group or community, be sure to ask yourself, is that a form of cultural capital wealth that's hegemonic, right? That really is oppressive. For example, if you say, well, linguistic capital, yeah, we spoke English in my whole life and I'm, English dominant. Is that a form of hegemonic community cultural wealth? If you have time and you want, and we're going to give you just about 3 or 4 minutes, how can you as a teacher or social justice advocate affirm, enhance, and sustain the cultural wealth that young people might be bringing in as they work with you? And then we can think about this in the broader sense. How do we leverage both our individual and collective community wealth to resist oppression and to self-actualize as a community? I'm hoping at least you'll talk about that first bubble, about 1 to 2 examples of how these have worked in your life. So again, either on your own for about 2 to 3 minutes or in pairs, if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment and think about this. And I'll go back to the slide that shows those various forms of wealth. More minute? About 10 more seconds. Would be willing to share an example of a form of cultural wealth and how it played out for you and your family, but also how it potentially played out or was instrumental for your own success. Anybody willing to share? You look like you're having a great conversation, by the way. I'll just say that.
I will.
Go ahead.
So for me, it was looking at ancestral as well as familial, because with growing up on a ranch, we learned hard work. And all of my siblings have been very successful in their lives with whatever they've went and done, and not constantly being praised for, oh, you're such a hard worker, you're such a hard worker. And that was something that was ingrained from the time we were little. And so I felt it fell into those categories.
So, and again, you look at it both as something that came from your longer ancestral history, but also from your more immediate, it's just that the way it played out in your family.
Correct.
Right, nice, good. Another example somebody shared.
So for me, I would say just based on my experience growing up with the parents that I had, I developed a lot of navigational culture or capital. My mother was a community college counselor, a math instructor, and mental health counselor. My father was a medical doctor. My stepfather worked at a university. My stepmother worked at a university. So for me, navigating all of those systems through a college environment and a medical environment was much, much easier, and I didn't realize how much easier it was for me than for other people until I started talking to other people about that.
Right.
And that's something that I can bring to bear as an educator as I work with first-generation students.
So the ability to navigate systems because your family was connected to those systems, they could kind of nurture you and support you, scaffold you to make sure that you were using those systems as they were. Really nice example, good. And one more example. Anybody else? Anybody over here?
Sure, yeah. So I'm curious, so for a teacher, what do we do with this idea of cultural wealth, community cultural wealth? How do we spread the wealth around, for example? Or what are some ways that we inhibit that wealth? Or we take away from, we subtract, we steal that wealth? These are not rhetorical questions. Yes?
I think that I was just talking with a student today about familial assets. She has a family who supports her going to college, but doesn't necessarily appreciate the work of college or the thoughts attached to college. And I think inviting students to have
Yeah, assisting students in seeing the positive and maybe negative assets. Do we have any STEM folks in the room? Science, technology, engineering, math? Oh, come on, STEM? Where's the STEM folks at? Okay, well, yeah. Well, I'm going to use a STEM example anyway. So I'm guessing people are humanities? Yeah? Physical education? No, oh wow, humanities. Well, I'm still going to do a STEM example. Okay. First law of thermodynamics. Oh no, sorry, is that triggering? I'm sorry. Sorry, say it again? I think that's like, no, that's something different. Yes, yes. Yeah, that's okay, that's okay, that's okay. You know what? Yes, we're gonna celebrate all knowledges and the affective domain on knowledges. So my understanding, somebody can Wikipedia it later because my PhD is not in this, but, oh, did you Wikipedia? Okay, so is LONGORIA correct? It is that, basically heat will flow to non-heat. Okay, yes, so I did get, okay. That's conservation of energy, right? So in not drawing upon and perhaps having a deficit approach, I might imagine that my students don't know this. And then in the Freudian critique sense, I'm going to expect that I need to bank that knowledge. That students are not coming in with any knowledge of the conservation of energy. Basically, I have a cold place and a warm place. The law of thermodynamics, the first law is that that heat is going to go to the colder place and not the other way around. The cold does not spread, the heat spreads. Now, we're in the middle of winter. What does your family do to save money on that light bill? You close the door, right? Yeah, you also insulate your windows. You do all kinds of things. Community and cultural wealth. Our families understand this. We embody the first law of thermodynamics. We might not be able to articulate that in the exact way that the schooling system wants us to tick that cute little box on that standardized test to say that we've learned it. But our ancestors have embodied that knowledge. So I just want to point out, oh good, this image is, this is real people's lives. This is not a cute concept for us to say, oh yes, my students have culture. That they indeed have wealth to be built upon. Geneva Gay says that, because she was here in 2014, Geneva Gay says we need to teach to and through students' cultures. That's culturally responsive teaching. Django Paris and Sami Alim say that we need to have students' identities to be sustained, that they should remain who they are. This is how we enact those theories. But simply to acknowledge, yes, my students have culture, and now I'm going to go on with business as usual. That is not liberatory practice. And so I just wanted to kind of flag that there has to be a kind of action and embodiment to these ideas so that our students, and as Francisco and I also want to argue too, so that teachers of color may also remain who they are. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
That's great. Well, again, and you can see that second question about what is it you can do as a teacher to help sustain students' wealth and affirm, enhance, and sustain the wealth that they bring in. I really invite you to take a deeper dive into that work as you find it in the book, Rethinking Ethnic Studies. Now, here's an important realization that I had in the last several years in thinking about Tara Yoso's work, and I call it being Tara Yoso. So remember, these forms of cultural community wealth were identified in a specific Latinx community. But that doesn't mean that all those forms of wealth are going to be in every Latinx community across the United States, right? So which forms of these cultural wealth are operating may be different, and there may be new ones, even beyond these, right? So in the African American community, they talk about community uplift. I see that as a form of capital. In the Native American community, they talk about responsibility and reciprocity. I see that as a form of capital. And you can just imagine that, the capital that you find in the Latinx community in an urban barrio is going to be different than the capital that you'd find in the Latinx community in a place like Legrand, right? So really what this asks us to do is not just to take those ideas and be like, okay, this is what it is, but rather to become like Terra Yoso. That is to ask in your own community, with the families and communities that are in your space, what are the specific forms of capital evident in for this specific community in this specific place, all right? So that's really what I've learned most from Terra Yoso. I could cite the 6 forms of cultural capital, but more important is take that posture of trying to understand the forms of cultural capital evident. Now all this, the work, Mole, Yoso, the work that people have been doing, Kauting, to really think about cultural capital come together in asset-based pedagogies for learning. And I like this definition from the California Department of Education, which really, because it's clear, it's distinct, it's short, not too, not too wordy, focusing on the strengths that diverse students bring to the classroom, respond against or move against deficit-based models of education, ensure equity in an increasingly diverse student population, which asks that we view students' differences as assets and not as deficits, right? So when you think about okay, we're finally getting to what is asset-based pedagogies, that is what it looks like. And it comes back to this model here, that we again see these connections between these other forms of, and other areas and lines of inquiry that are important to thinking about how we see this as kind of like an orbit, right? These are other lines of inquiry or other academic foci that are like revolving around and mutually reinforcing asset-based pedagogies. So here's what all of those share. They all share a desire to help students sustain their identities. They all share connecting to students, families, and communities. They all share starting with and valuing students' prior knowledge and insights. They all work to build on students' knowledge as well as their cultural and linguistic resources. As you can see, they're all pushing against a deficit ideology. They're all critiquing hegemony and oppression and trying to disrupt unequal relations of power. They're all focused on ways of thinking, of rethinking how we teach in terms of curriculum, teaching, classroom organization and management, evaluation, and family engagement. And they all desire, and this is from Paris and Alim's work, to perpetuate and foster, they use the word, and to sustain linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism as part of the larger democratic project of schooling. So here are some of the goals. We're trying to get our students to have a sense of belonging, to feel that they have a sense of agency, they can actually make things happen, to enhance their emotional, social, and intellectual well-being, to spur their academic engagement, and because they're academically engaged, more likely to be academically successful, but also to foster joy and healing and hopefulness and positivity for students and communities who've been historically and contemporarily marginalized. LONGORIA this morning, by the way, I have to tell you, in preparing for these conversations that we've had the best conversations we've had as a team, because we're learning and working with each other and trying to understand where we're coming from. And this morning while we were or yesterday actually when we were talking about this, LONGORIA asked a good question. Well, that's what it's trying to do, but what is it trying to resist? Like, what is asset-affirming pedagogy is really trying to resist? And so we had to think about, well, that's a great question. We're trying to resist deficit ideologies. We're trying to resist monoculturalism and monolingualism. We're trying to decenter, or we're trying to resist centering whiteness, to what LONGORIA mentioned about identity adverse, being identity adverse. We're trying to resist decontextualizing our students, not just seeing them as a student, like right there, George, or Mark, or Casey, but rather to really understand them in the totality of who they are and the spaces in which they come from. And it's trying to unstandardize or to pushes against standardization in schools and disrupting the goal of assimilation and disempowerment that U.S. schools have a very long history of engaging with. Well, this is going to end this session. We're going to actually now turn this over to KRISTEN and Liz to kind of have a dialogue about what does asset-affirming pedagogy look like from their perspectives. And so we're going to go ahead and turn it over to the two of them. Are you going to come up here? What do you want to do?
I think we're just going to scoot over and you two can ask us the questions from the podium.
All right.
Can you all hear me? Great.
Hello.
We're the lucky ones. We get to just sit and enjoy this conversation with you all. So I'm KRISTEN.
Hi, I'm Liz Kelly.
And this is Arceli Jesse Raphael, for those of you who remember.
So we first wanted to, thinking about it, again, this notion of creating a home in schools, ask, what was it that created a home for school for you? And this question specifically for you, Liz.
So for my undergrad, I got a degree in human services, and I knew that I wanted to do like social work in a school setting. And at the time, my major didn't offer any education courses. So that's how I ended up meeting KRISTEN, is because I took her LED class, which is like introduction into elementary education. And the first thing that stood out to me about her class was her hospitality. I'm from the Tri-Cities, which is in Eastern Washington, and it's pretty similar to like over here. And like everyone has been like very hospitable and like very friendly. But like when I moved to the western side of Washington, people don't just like say like hello to you. People are like more reserved. So like I had transferred there, and then I walk into her class and she has a whole array of food. She's just smiling and she's so excited that everyone is like in her class. And I was like, oh my God, because when I transferred there, I was just like so alone. And then like when I met her, I was like, wow. So from the beginning, she just created like a really safe space for me and other students. And then her class was like about how to teach multicultural education in like any setting. And from the beginning, she outlined like what the basis of the class was. So like one of the things she said is like, we're not going to play devil's advocate, because sometimes we're talking about like sensitive topics that had to do with like racism in higher education or like in K through like 6th grade. And she, from the very beginning, was just like, this is how we're going to go about it. So there was never any room for like myself to feel like objectified or just feel like uncomfortable if we're talking about issues like such as like slavery or like something like that. So like that's like how I felt safe in her class. And like she just, KRISTEN did it for everyone. So yeah.
So I think that, just in response to, thank you, Liz, for that, and thank you for doing it publicly. Liz and I prepared for this, and we were like, we're going to cry. We know we're going to cry. And I think I just want to say that, we really, when Liz and I started prepping for this and talking about LONGORIA and Francisco's book on creating a home in schools, what does that really look like? And so Liz and I, again, similar to us having these beautiful conversations, it's really about relationship building and really showing up for each other. And one of the things that, Liz, talked about was that, so Liz, do you mind if I share your birthday? Okay. So Liz is born on Halloween. Oh my gosh, how amazing. So how could you ever forget Liz's birthday? And Liz is, just such an incredible human, and I was so grateful to have Liz in class. And so Liz had talked about how significant it was for me to even remember her birthday. We're in the fall quarter, and I gave Liz a birthday card, and that just was a moment. But it was on the other side of this relationship building too, was that Liz had shared that at the time that Liz took the course, my mother was in hospice, and that it wasn't difficult, or it was a difficult time for me. But what was of value to Liz and for me was to be able to share that part of my life with my students. So I wasn't trying to hide who I was or what we were experiencing, that we were able to be in relationship and community with each other. And that was really important.
So related to the question of how do you remain who you are, what identities do you sustain? What are your identities?
Such a good question, Liz.
We talked about this yesterday, but I think my family is what has like kept me rooted, and then like obviously like the community I have here. But I mentioned that I'm from the Tri-Cities, but I'm adopted. So growing up, my parents never looked like me, but they always like tried their hardest to make sure that my culture and was like integrated into everything that I did. So in the summers, they would take me like all around the whole United States and like take me to like where I was born in Jeffersonville, Indiana, and take me to all these Black history museums and like just make sure that I knew like where I came from and like what my culture was, but also how like the world works. So like I wasn't just sheltered. So that's also why KRISTEN's class made so much sense to me and like I connected with it so much, because the way she was teaching multicultural education was the way that I learned about multicultural education when I was younger. But yeah, I just think it's my family, and they've supported me like through all of my endeavors and like me getting a master's and even undergrad. Like KRISTEN had dinner with my family the other day, and like they visited me at work and stuff. But yeah, like it's always been like my family. Like my dad is just like a little old white man, but like he knows how to braid hair, he can like cornrow, and like most people, like no one ever knew that I was like, I tell people I'm adopted all the time, but everyone, which is like, everyone was just always so confused when like my parents would show up for like parent teacher day or something, because they'd always be like, oh, I didn't know that your parents were white, which is like something like weird to say to like a second grader, but like it's just like stuff like that where it's just like I was always like well taken care of, and like just like little things like that, I guess. But yeah, my family has just been like a really good support system.
So for those of you who have known me now for 5 years, you probably know a little bit more about me than lots of folks. But I am Amskapi Pakani, Blackfeet, Grovan, Anin, and Eastern Band Cherokee and White. And I'll talk a little bit more about the kind of next phases of, you know, this sustaining identities tonight, and you'll get to meet my daughter, Elizabeth. I have a thing for Elizabeths. I can't help myself. And so you'll get to meet Elizabeth tonight. We'll talk more about that. But I, too, was, you know, a student who came to, I'm a Western grad as well, Western Washington University undergrad, and I was a non-traditional student when I got to school, and the reason I even made it to a four-year university is because at community college I had a really incredible mentor who drove me physically up to Western and introduced me to professors. And so I think for me, how was I sustained? I was sustained by community. It was community that drove me to Western, made sure I was successful. And then when it came time for me to, I was a classroom teacher for several years, went back to graduate school to be a better teacher, and ended up falling in love with higher ed, and coming back to Western specifically to give back to the community that had given so much to me. And so then I meet Liz, and it's just a natural, beautiful opportunity to, you know, have this reciprocal relationship where I learn as much from Liz as, you know, Liz learns in our community space. And it keeps going, and it's still that way.
What about the future? So you talked a little bit about what identities you're sustaining. What is it going to take to sustain those identities for the future or in the future?
I think like the biggest thing that I've learned for me is like to always be a continuous learner. I learned that from like KRISTEN and other Black women in higher education. It's like the smartest people that I was meeting in higher education were the ones that made like learning the most accessible, and they always like vocalized how they were always like continuously learning. Like some people had like PhDs, but they still, even with a PhD, they're like, oh, I'm not like an expert fully in this, and like I'm always like humbling myself. So like for me, it's like always learning new things and like always probably like coming at things from like a stance of like humility, because like I can never learn, like I'll always need to know like new things. And because like the outside world is changing so quickly and like the systems that I work in like are always changing, it's just always knowing that it's okay to like learn new things, you know?
I really appreciate that, and in our conversation together and, wrestling with these questions, Liz brought up how important it was to not only, well, we labeled it as rewriting history as well as rewriting history. So we're writing and then we're making it right. And that truth-telling was ultimately really important. So I think as far as like the future is continuously telling the truth about our histories and our experiences, but then it has to be more than that. And, we've been talking a lot about that it's not, the goal isn't to keep fighting. The goal is well-being and everyone's health and well-being. So how do we get there together? We can't get there without disrupting, as we've seen in this, and identifying our community cultural wealth. But it's also about thriving. And so my hope is that this work that we're doing then becomes so Liz is, the next generation, right? Or is this current generation? And Liz is taking this work already. She's doing this work in higher ed as working with recruitment and retention of students on campus, particularly students who've been historically and contemporarily marginalized. And then it's going to be her students, and then those students, and the next students. So how Liz models, how we model, how we all work to model health and well-being together, I think is hopefully how we'll begin to create a future that we're fighting for now. Great. Liz, is there anything you wanted to share?
I think also going off of what KRISTEN was saying, one of the ways that I've like honored all of the things that I've learned is always like sharing what I've learned with like everyone. And like KRISTEN will tell you, I'm like a walking like billboard for like all of her classes, like tribal sovereignty, like elementary education. Like I'm always advertising because like I have like so much knowledge in my head. And like to me, if like I don't share it, then like what's the point of learning? So like all the things that I've like learned from like LONGORIA, like I'm like LONGORIA is in like secondary ed, and I graduated with a degree in human services, and I currently have 3 human services interns in my office, and there was students that were interested about secondary education, so I was like, oh, you should meet LONGORIA, and then I was able to show them like LONGORIA's book, and they were able to like identify with LONGORIA, and it was just like something that was so amazing for me, so like I just love to share information with people.
Liz is like the connector. Like we take Liz, to like the tribal school, or Liz is here. And there was a student yesterday who lost their phone in this space, and who found the student, gave the phone back? Liz. Liz is here for 20 minutes and already the connector. And so that's a superpower. And of course that superpower came into the classroom. One thing I want to add to what Liz was talking about too is how important it is to have establishing boundaries. And so I love the Prentice Hemphill quote, boundaries are the distance between me loving you and still loving myself. And I think that those kinds of boundaries, Liz and I talked about in the classroom, that sometimes are associated with the syllabus, but they're also associated with that, creating a brave and loving space, right? We can't necessarily have a safe space because we could. That's going to take a long time journey and a long-term relationship, and we're going to have a lot of work on how do we resolve conflict and how do we communicate and have open and honest communication. But for us, it was also talking about, as Liz talked about, the boundaries of what we will accept or not accept in a space. And so just building on one of the things Liz said about no devil's advocate, but and how we clearly outline, if you have, this is not a space where we're gonna grapple with whether racism exists or heterosexism or transphobia. Those things exist. And then we were all talking this morning about, we can't wait until multicultural education is a thing of the past. Like, that is a goal where we don't need these classes anymore. But I think also the boundaries also have to have room for dialogue. So again, the boundary is that all students need to have a sense of belonging and a brave space, but it shouldn't cause harm. And that's where we as professors or teachers come in. If a student does have questions like, I'm still grappling with racism, then you come speak to me. You bring those questions to me, and let's have a good dialogue. And I'll do my best to find the resources that you need in order to do that. But anyway, I just want to say too that it's really a gift to be here with Liz. Like, we, as educators, to have students that you get to truly love and be chosen family with is pretty incredible. And I think part of that too is sustaining those relationships. And we've been really lucky. And I just want to also thank Liz for sharing her family with me. And like Liz said, we got to have dinner with her folks, and that was just incredible. And it's just, now we're on a different level. We get to stay in the same room together, and Liz gets to hear me snore. And I'm not suggesting that you do that with all your students. They have to be particularly special and forgiving. But anyway, I just want to thank you all for holding this space for us. And I would just want to thank you, Liz, for being a wonderful student. I'm not going to cry. We'll save that for tomorrow. And if you want to know more about Liz, come tomorrow. Liz is going to share some really cool stuff.
Well, we have just a few minutes left, but open it up now for you to, any questions or comments or things that you'd like to share with us in the last 3 or 4 minutes that we have together.
I'll be brief. So, growing up where I did, we had one student in the high school that was of a different ethnic background. He was part African American, part Hispanic, part Indian, and part white. That's all we knew. And so I have pushed myself to learn about different cultures, different ethnicities, things of basically trying to figure out what I don't know. And so where can I find more resources? How do I bring up those conversations of, I haven't got this experience. We didn't know any type of racism. He was just one of the kids in our class because it was Michael. And so I haven't been exposed to certain things that others have been, so I don't know what questions to ask. Where's a good place to start?
Go ahead, Liz.
Hi. So like when you're like dealing with these issues, it's always best like not directly ask that person, so like you're not objectifying them. So like growing up, like I was the only Black person like in like my 2nd grade class. Like I never had a Black teacher until college. And like during Black History Month, like my teacher would expect me to do a whole entire lesson about Black history, and like I don't like speak for all Black people, and like as a 2nd grader, like it was inappropriate for me to do that. But there's always like free resources out there. So like in social work, like when I go into like any setting, I always like Google the history of that community, like how like I look at the population and like the historical history. So like I get like an accurate depiction of like what I'm going into, but then I just listen to the people and like what they want. but it's just about being like culturally sensitive, and like you can never like learn like too much, but like just don't, like as a Black person, it's not my job to teach like a non-Black person about like history and stuff. So it's just like coming from like a lens of like humility, but like Google is good, but there's like a whole bunch of free curriculums online that like outline like the Black experience in history. And then like Washington State has the STI, since time immemorial curriculum. I know that we're in Oregon, and Oregon has different resources, but like there's different cultural centers that you can like ask, and there's people who are hired like through cultural centers and other things that like get paid to like come and teach people too.
Trying to be mindful of time. I think we could, anybody else want to share any thoughts there? We are going to be talking about ways to invite students' identities into the classroom. So much like the way that Liz talked about it, rather than me, saying, oh, this is the kind of person you are, and now I'm going to make all these assumptions. How do you invite them to share those cultural identities in the classroom? And that's going to be a big part of what we're going to be trying to model in class or in the session, the workshop tomorrow. So if you can make it, then don't forget. Well, we want to be mindful of time. Again, we really want to take a moment to thank Eastern Oregon University, thank the Center for Culturally Responsive Practices, and thank Tanya and the team for all the ways in which you've supported us and all the connections that we've had that will continue to strengthen and grow. So, thank you.
Thank you.
KRISTEN, I don't have a mic. Can you just announce 6 o'clock keynote?
6 o'clock keynote. Come on back if you want more of this glorious information. Or just us.